heard that.
It's lost, yeah.
Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see so many people at our 13th, I hadn't realised it was 13, annual lecture. I'm Lucy Blue, I'm the Maritime Archaeological Director of the Honor Frost Foundation, and I'm delighted to invite our speaker this evening, Professor Steve Sidebotham from the University of Delaware. That bit's obvious. Well, we've known each other for at least 20 years, I'd say, with a common interest in the coastal archaeology, particularly the Roman port sites, the subject of the lecture this evening, of the Egyptian Red Sea coast. We used to work in the sister port to the north. But we didn't last 30 years. That's how long Steve's been working at Berenike. Steve's a world-renowned archaeologist and historian. I would recommend going on tours of archaeological sites and possibly also tours of British Museum exhibitions, which he did earlier. He's a font of all knowledge, not just of the ancient world, the ancient Roman world. You've worked in from Egypt to India, but also he has interests in veterans from the Second World War, which I think is fascinating, the oral histories. So I am absolutely convinced this is going to be a delight, as Danny would say. We're really looking forward to it. We're very glad that you've accepted, and we're looking forward to hearing about the latest results. And I'm particularly interested in the cemetery of the pets. I hope it's in there.
Yes, it is. Yes.
Thank you very much, Steve.
Thank you so much.
Well, thank you for that great introduction. I also want to thank the Honor Frost Foundation for supporting our work at the site over the years, and I want to thank our team, because this is a team effort. So all of the staff of the Berenike project and my co-directors, my current fellow co-directors, Rodney Ast from Heidelberg University and Olaf Kopper from Leiden. Without them, we could not do this work. It's very much a team effort, so I'm representing the team here, not just me. So let's go ahead. As you see here from this map, Berenike, circled in white, was obviously on this extensive maritime and terrestrial set of trade routes that linked Africa, Europe, and Asia together, especially in the first few centuries following the start of the Christian era. And what's so interesting at our site now with all the excavations, it was hard to decide what to talk about tonight. So I'm concentrating on the finds from India and on the ships that brought these goods and these people to the site. But we have plenty of evidence in the form of pottery and a myriad of other types of finds that indicate the cosmopolitan nature of this port. And we know from pottery and all the other types of finds that Berenike's commercial connections extended at least as far west as the Iberian Peninsula and northwest Africa, basically the area of Morocco, clear across the Mediterranean, the Near East, Red Sea, down the Indian Ocean coast of Africa, the Persian Gulf, India, and as far east as Indonesia, as this bead from Jatim in eastern Indonesia indicates. One of the other indications of the international cosmopolitan nature of Berenike is the fact that we have documented thus far 12 written languages from the site, and I'm sure we'll find more in the future from Europe, Africa, and from Asia. That could be a whole lecture in itself. Berenike, if you're not familiar with the site, here are two maps of it. Was founded by Ptolemy II Philadelphus, who was the son of one of the generals of Alexander the Great. He founded it in around 275 BC. We can't be sure of the precise date. And it continued to function into the middle of the 6th century AD, so it had roughly an 800-year history. And you can see the location of the port at the very southeastern end of the Ptolemaic Empire, and by the same token, at the very southeastern end of the Roman world as well. And of course, the size of the Roman Empire at its peak, as you see on that map, the quantity and the quality of goods passing through Berenike increased dramatically over what it had been during the Ptolemaic period. Now, as you can see from these two maps and this satellite image, Berenike is located approximately 825 kilometers south-southeast of Suez, the modern city of Suez, and roughly, if I can use this little pointer properly, it's roughly 260 kilometers east of Aswan. It's very noticeable. There's a little cape that sticks out there called Ras Banas, and the site is immediately south of Ras Banas. Now, of course, anybody that wants to sail to or from Berenike is going to have to understand very well how the wind patterns in the Red Sea operate. And if you've been there, you know they're usually very powerful northerly winds, but that can change on occasion. And also the Indian Ocean monsoon. So without a knowledge of how these winds operate, of course, sailing to and from the site would have been virtually impossible. Now, the site itself, even after working there 30 years, is still growing. It's covered in sand, and so after each sandstorm or any heavy wind, you go out and say, "Ooh, we didn't see that before." So there's entire areas, especially in the area marked by the yellow box, that have turned up that we didn't know about before. So it's added more for us to work on in the future. To give you an idea of the size of the site, look at the red box. This represents 10,000 square meters. And if you take a look at this, this is a geomagnetic image, which basically means it's an X-ray of the site and what buildings and other features lie immediately beneath the surface. And so as a result of this type of work, we can, of course, more carefully place our trenches and hopefully achieve better results. And that's usually the case, though not always. So here is the most recent map based on, we just left the field in 2024 at the end of January this year. We're hoping to go back, of course, in this coming winter. The three areas, there's actually 6 major areas, despite what this plan shows. But what we're basically going to concentrate on here tonight, if I can push the right button, there we go. I'm not seeing it up here, the red. But anyway, take a look. So you see the pet cemetery, which everybody's clamored about. That's in the early Roman trash dump, basically first, 2nd century AD. The Isis temple has proved to be a literal gold mine of finds. And then more recently, the northern complex, which you see there, has also turned up some interesting material. So those are the 3 areas we're going to concentrate on here. And another one briefly, and that is the southwestern harbor. We have all kinds of goodies that'll please the maritime crowd. Okay, so because we've had such a long history at the site, it's gone through a number of changes in terms of who's co-directing it. I don't want to go through all of this, but starting in 2022, for a variety of reasons, we have now 2 separate projects working on the site at different times. We have a Polish-led one, which was A down at the bottom, and then we have B, our project, which is, as you know, a joint American, German, and Dutch project. So I'm dividing this lecture up into 3 parts. The first part is going to be showing you examples of artifacts and ecofacts, and if you're not sure what an ecofact is, it's a naturally occurring object like a seed or a bone or a stone, and that come from India for the most part, sometimes from Sri Lanka. But are they evidence for South Asians actually residing at the port? Are they simply evidence that these trade items pass through the port? Okay, that'll be the first thing I talk about. Then, to please the maritime group here, which of course is a necessity, I have plenty of tantalizing images of anchors and ship remains and all those kind of things, so that'll get you excited. These are, of course, evidence for the ships that actually carried these cargoes and these people to the site. And thirdly, we're going to look at not evidence but proof for lawyers out there, you know what the difference is. We're going to look at proof that, in fact, South Asians did reside at the site and probably for extended periods. So let's look at the first category, and that is artifacts and ecofacts from the subcontinent that certainly got there by ship. Were they brought by Indians or by others? That we don't know. But I will show you some examples. So probably the best example is the pottery. We found a steady stream of Indian-made pottery. If you take a look at the top right there, those black sherds, that's fine dinnerware made in India. I think they found some at Kusera as well. Swastikas appearing on Indian-made pottery are fairly frequent. This was a good luck symbol in India for many millennia. And so we find that often on Indian-made sherds. And then finally, of great interest is this Tamil Brahmi graffito, carved interestingly on a Roman amphora from the 1st century AD. We have lots of Indian coarse and cooking wares, which suggests, probably people from India were cooking their traditional meals at the site. But again, we can't prove that with 100% certainty. Now, for the ecofacts, that is the things that occur in nature, we have a number of botanical remains and faunal remains. And probably the most important commodity that we know from the ancient sources traded from southwest India to the Roman world was black pepper. And we found massive quantities of this at the site. In addition to thousands of peppercorns found throughout the site, we found in 1999 this jar, which you see, and I'm not sure why this isn't working, but if you look at the slide on the bottom left, you see two jars there. The one that does not have a cover on it contains 7.55 kilograms of black peppercorns. This is the largest single concentration of black peppercorns found anywhere in the ancient world, and of course we brag about that all the time. Here you see it again. But some of the other eco-facts that we find include coconut husks, and you say, well, that's not necessarily evidence of coming from India, but certainly from the Northwest Indian Ocean. And this isn't just flotsam or jetsam that came into the port. We find this at every level in the Roman period, and so clearly it was deliberately imported. Another very interesting commodity, it's amazing what you learn talking to the specialists on site, is these red seeds. They're very hard. They're called Abrus cricatorius. I knew nothing about these before. And they go by a number of common names. They're of uniform weight. So up until very recently, they were used to weigh gold in jewelry shops in India. But they're highly toxic, so you don't want to chew on one of these. And the plant on which it grows is highly invasive. So what's it doing here? We speculated because, of course, a lot of frankincense and myrrh, which is a gum resin, is imported from southwest Arabia and the Horn of Africa. We speculate, and of course it congeals together, so we speculated that these things were placed in shipments of frankincense and myrrh to retard, if you will, the coagulation of these gum resins together. An analogy would be finding rice in a salt shaker in a restaurant to keep the salt from sticking together. So the region where the black pepper was from, if you take a look at this map of India, was the southwestern coast, the Malabar coast of India, and specifically from the western Ghat Mountains. And if you're not familiar with pepper, except in the form in which you see it in the grocery store, it's a clinging vine that you see there on the left. It produces a very green fruit, if you will, which when collected, harvested, turns black, of course, and then you separate those off and you get the peppercorns that you're familiar with in the grocery store. This is one of many spice shops in Kochi, which is on the Malabar coast in this general area of the Ghat Mountains, and you can see sacks of pepper and, of course, different varieties of it as well. So here's our Abrus cricatorius seeds, which I seem to be fixated on, with yet more common names, and I've already speculated on what those were used for at the site. Now, none of the photographs here are actually from items at Berenike. I pulled these from the internet, but we did in fact find these items at the site, and they're all imports from the subcontinent. Mung beans, which were regularly consumed, rice, which isn't a big surprise for those of you from that part of the world. Interestingly, we've found out that rice also was cultivated in the Near East starting in the early Roman period. So we can't be certain if this rice is in fact from India or from the Near East. And then finally, Job's tear is not edible, but these hard seeds are often drilled through to make beads in the form of jewelry. Interestingly, too, we have a number of wood species that originate from the subcontinent. We only found this large papyrus this past January, dated to the early Roman period, and it makes reference to, among other things, Indian rosewood, which was imported from the subcontinent. And I went back just the other day to look to see if we'd actually found any Indian rosewood, and in fact, we found 3 pieces. So that's nice to have confirmation from a papyrus on site for something that's being imported. Okay, now the pet cemetery that everybody wanted to hear about. This, in fact, early on was our early Roman trash dump. We started excavating here in the 90s, and we started running across animal burials, and they were burials, deliberately buried. They weren't just animals that went out and died out there or were dumped out there after they passed. And so far, we're still excavating this, we found over 750 animal burials, and they were clearly pets, as you will see. The vast bulk are felines, especially cats and kittens, with second largest group being dogs and puppies, and then we have a scattering of monkeys and other animals, as you will see. So that's the general area circled in yellow of the early Roman trash dump / pet cemetery. So they're one and the same general location. So initially we didn't do any work here, and then in 1996 we were walking across the site one day after the wind blows and the rain falls, and lo and behold, on the surface was a horde of ostraca. So obviously this immediately grabbed our attention, and we started digging here, and those top 2 photographs are from 1996 when we first found this horde and started digging. And then the more we dug, the more we realized this is also an animal cemetery. So that photograph on the bottom comes from this past winter. You can see one of our Polish colleagues digging in the pet cemetery. The ostraca, for the most part, from here are early Roman in date. They tend to be public records, oftentimes items being put on board ships. Sometimes, as I'll show you in just a second here, these are actually ostraca indicating the Roman army's control of the water supply, the fresh water supply going into the city, which was probably rationed for obvious reasons. This is a reed pen in the middle there on the slide on your right. And I forgot to mention before here, that's another reed writing pen and part of an inkwell, which we found mixed with the ostraca. Sometimes the ostraca are in poor condition. And you photograph them the best you can, and then we've, of course, realized that infrared photography can sometimes really improve that. So that's the same sherd with regular photography on the left, infrared on the right. So you can see sometimes the infrared really does add to our ability to read these documents. The papyri, on the other hand, tend to be more private records rather than public. And we have a number of these, and the number is growing every year. And you can see on the top left, for example, the bill of sale for a white male donkey from the time of Nero, actually. And on the right, I love this. It's a letter from a mother Hikane to her son complaining that he never writes her. That could have been written yesterday by your kids. And then the bottom left is a poem about the goddess Cybele. Another interesting category of written finds that no one really thinks about too much are ancient jar stoppers, which were inscribed or impressed and painted with the names of people who were either shipping the product in them or were the people who produced the product in the jars. So we found, I don't know how many of these, and I know you've turned up a lot at Couser. Finally, in the same dump, the early Roman trash dump pet cemetery, back in 2001, you see I've circled the trench there in red, we found this guy. It doesn't look like much. It's a fragmentary terracotta figurine, clearly of a soldier. He's wearing some kind of body armor. He's carrying a shield. He's got a helmet, so to speak. We don't know what else he might have had. Oh, we do. He probably carried a spear, as you'll see. In fact, you can see it there. There's a little hole deliberately made in the shield by the person who made the terracotta, and it originally probably held either a wooden or a metal implement, a spear or a pilum of some kind of javelin or whatever. So when we first found him, we immediately thought, okay, he's probably a Roman auxiliary soldier. We have ostraca that tell us the Roman army was here. And so that was our immediate guess. But we weren't really quite happy with the parallels. And so we started looking around Trajan's column in Rome, the column of Marcus Aurelius. We found soldiers that looked sort of like our guy. But it wasn't precise, and we were a little nervous about that. Here's detail from the column of Marcus Aurelius in Rome with similarly clad soldiers. And then one of our trench supervisors, who's brilliant, and she knows that. I tell her that all the time to keep her happy, and it's true, said, well, why can't it be an Indian-made terracotta? And we know that the city of Ter, or Tagara in central India, was in fact a major choroplastic manufacturing center. I said, well, Joanna, tell me more. Okay, you need to convince me away from my theory that turned out to be wrong, I think. Here's a location of Ter in a map of the Satyavanna polity, which we'll hear more about later. And so she said, yeah, I can show you some parallels that might be convincing. So I said, okay. So she came up with a number of them. I can't show them all, but what's especially interesting are the representations of the eyes. We have not been able to do any chemical analysis on the clay for a whole variety of reasons I can get into later if you want to hear those. And so I said, okay. And so actually all of this is going to be published at the end of next calendar year. And if you're interested, I can send you a copy of that. Anyway, the pet cemetery, the pet part of the cemetery. I was waiting to build up the anticipation. So as I said, we have about 750 animals thus far, with certainly more to come. And you say, how do we know they're pets and they didn't just die there or were thrown out here by people when the animals died in the city? They're deliberately buried. If you look at the dog, and it's the same dog in all three pictures, you'll see he's actually wrapped in a mat, and he's furthermore covered with broken amphora sherds. So he's obviously been deliberately buried. He was a canine who died about the age of 7 of osteosarcoma, bone cancer. And we know the species, it's the bottom left there, and we don't know, of course, if that's the correct color. We also occasionally find human remains in the trash dump. That's the bottom part of a 25-year-old male. And then further indicating the pet nature of these animals, if you look where the red arrow is on the left and the red circle, those are collars that have been left on the animals after they perish. So the top left there is an iron collar. The bottom right is a kitten with a bead collar, and sometimes we find the iron collars and the beads separated from the animals, but in the dump, often next to them. Sometimes the collars are made of copper alloy, bronze. Here's a cat with one such collar. And then a monkey there on the bottom right with iron collars. So finding these animals with iron collars is fairly common. And then this one was very touching for me, being an animal lover, the top left. We just found this in January. It's a baby monkey hugging a kitten in the afterlife. So I was very moved by that. Now, the part that's of interest to the to us, besides the pets and everything, is the fact that while most of these animals can be provenance to Northeast Africa, which is not a surprise, we also have some that come from much farther afield. For example, we've done DNA analysis on this, and we have Asian wildcat, and you can see the range of that animal, at least today. And we have 2 species of macaque monkeys, and you can see the ranges there. All of these species occur in the subcontinent, but also can be found in Central Asia and points to the east. So the big question is, how did they get to Berenike? Well, clearly they must have come on board a ship, but did they come as stowaways, or did someone deliberately bring them as pets? Well, given their location in the cemetery, we suggest that they were brought deliberately as pets. By whom? Was it Indians or not? We can't prove that one way or the other. Coins, of course, notoriously, coins travel long distances through second and third parties. So we have these Satyavanna issues, which were interestingly found in the Isis temple and were possibly dedications there. And I'll show you where we found those in a minute. We have another Indian coin, a silver one from the 4th century AD. And you can see its source in India there. We have large numbers, and by that I mean thousands, of beads, some of them semi-precious, some of them just glass, that we have identified as coming from India and or Sri Lanka. There's some examples there on the bottom left. And also cameo blanks, which come from northwestern India. These would have been shipped west, and eventually worked up into the cameo that you see there, not from Berenike, probably in workshops either in Alexandria or in the Bay of Naples area, possibly elsewhere. Textiles. We have a lot of textiles from India. Again, who brought them? We can't say for certain. This one's particularly interesting. It's resist cotton dyed textile from a 5th century trash dump at Berenike. And if you look at this cave painting from Ajanta, cave number 17 from the 5th century AD, look what's hanging on the wall. It's almost an exact parallel for ours. And having visited some of the sites on the Silk Road, at the old museum in Urumqi on the Silk Road, there was a piece exactly like ours there as well. So clearly the Indians were mass producing this stuff in the 5th century, and it was being used domestically and shipped overseas as well. Now, let's get to the maritime side of it. I know there's a crowd that's just eager, chomping at the bit. So let's go. So from the Isis temple especially, we have actually dozens and dozens of inscriptions, usually dedicated to Isis on behalf of crews and ships that have survived the voyage in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea. So I'll show you some examples of that. And we also have papyri and ostraca that specifically discuss ships' gear and equipment, and one of them actually mentions a ship by name. So let's take a look at that. So here's an ortho photo of the Isis temple, where we've been digging fairly consistently since around 2015. And as you can see from the caption there, A is the staircase entrance. This ortho photo, in fact, represents everything up to the end of the last dig season. So A is the staircase entrance, B is the repository, keep that in mind. C, the largest area of the temple, is the courtyard. This has dozens and dozens of inscriptions. If you look at all those little square features there, those are statue bases, many of which have inscriptions in Greek from the Roman period, dating from the middle of the 1st century AD up to 305 is our latest attested inscription. D is the actual covered part of the temple. We're not going to be talking about that tonight. And E is the repository, which we will talk about. So let's take a look at two of the areas that are of huge importance for evidence of, it's not just evidence, it's proof Indians were at the site. It's irrefutable proof the Indians lived at the site. And they come from the portico area in yellow there and from our courtyard area, which I've already referenced previously. So let's take a look. We know that the temple in its current manifestation was built during the reign of Tiberius by a wealthy Roman merchant from the Bay of Naples area named Marcus Laelius Cosmos. You can see a large chunk of the inscription he dedicated to Isis and for the construction of the temple. So clearly an incredibly wealthy businessman who wanted to pay homage to Isis, whom he saw as a protector of his ships, of his crews, and more importantly, of the merchandise on those ships being brought to the city. So again, there's a view at the top of the courtyard looking north, and on the bottom of the courtyard looking south. You can see all the statue bases and inscriptions there. I can just show you a few of the inscriptions. That would be a whole lecture in its own right. One of the more intriguing ones is this one from early in the 2nd century AD that mentions a dedication to Isis, of course, by a secretary in charge of an aromatics warehouse. Okay, you can just, your mind reels with what was in that aromatics warehouse. We have yet to find that aromatics warehouse. So it's out there somewhere. We don't know where. And then our friend, Laelius Cosmos, again makes an appearance. He has at least 2 dedications in the temple that he built, dating from the reign of Claudius, and in which he thanks Isis for protecting his crews on voyages coming in from the Erythrothallus, which could be the Indian Ocean or just the Red Sea. These types of inscriptions dedicated to Isis, thanking her for protecting crews and ships, and the word merchandise doesn't appear, but it's sort of understood, appears on these texts throughout this entire period. Here you can see one from the reign of Hadrian, thanking Isis for a safe voyage. And then ostraca from that early Roman trash dump pet cemetery. We have hundreds of these things. So far they've been published in 3 volumes with more forthcoming. This particular one actually records the name of one of the ships that came into harbor at Berenike, the Gymnasiarchis. We don't know any more about this ship than its name. Then we have representations of ships, not a surprise. On the left, it's really interesting. That's a cartouche from the Isis temple from the Roman period, but if you look very closely, it's a four-masted ship. And so I've never heard of a four-masted ship in the Roman period, so I would defer to Lucy, put her on the spot. She can comment on that later. And then, on this graffito from the early Roman period, we have, again, a Roman-era ship. Let me get a drink here. We can't really tell if it's at sail, probably, or if it's at port. We can't be completely sure of that, but we know that's from an early Roman. That is a 1st century AD context. Now, very interesting, we find large quantities of timber at the site. And contrary to what we expected, most of the timber is not Egyptian. It's imported, with the largest quantity of imported timber being teak from India, and the second largest quantity being cedar, probably from Lebanon. What's it doing here? Well, clearly it was used to build ships, or in this case, repair ships at the site. Now, why, on that count, do I show you these images of these wooden Serapis figures? There's a pair of them. You see the arrows associating the one with the other, different views. These are made of teak wood, and I doubt that the teak was imported deliberately just to carve these heads. I believe they came from recycled ship parts. Little guy on the bottom, a fig wood Serapis, doesn't really figure into the discussion. But here I'll show you what we have found of the ship graffito. What is that? E. Of course, we've looked at that before. Brailing rings or braille rings. So we found hundreds of these. They're made of wood or animal horn. They are usually, as you see from the image, sewn to sails, and then ropes are put through them so that you can raise and lower the sails on the masts. We also have these leather reinforcements that may have been used at the corners of sails to reinforce them. Alternatively, of course, or in addition, they could have been used as camel girths or tent ends or a whole variety of things. And then on the bottom left there, we have the remains of very thin pieces of lead with holes in them. And clearly these had at one time been nailed to the keels, or it's not just to the keels, but to the bottom parts of these merchant ships. And of course, there's plenty of parallels for that in the Mediterranean, where they predominantly used lead, occasionally copper. And we found a fair amount of this. You can see the little holes there where they would have tacked that on to the bottom part, those parts of the ships that were underwater most of the time. And of course, there's plenty of parallels for that from the Mediterranean, dating, I think, from the later Hellenistic period on into Roman times. Some of the other objects, so on the left there, it may have been a lifting net to move cargoes off or on the ship. Alternatively, it could have served as a pannier on donkeys and camels to carry cargo. Can't be sure, maybe both. More brailing rings and lead sheathing. And the two sails there are very interesting. They're cotton canvas kind of things. And our experts tell us that they're made in a weaving pattern from India, that discarded in the trash dump. And in some cases, you can see the brailing rings still have some of the string attached. We didn't redo that. That's how we found it. That would have been tied to the sails to allow the crews to lower and raise the mast. We have some other tantalizing pieces here. We can't prove that these are anchors or lighthouses, but they look like that to me. So if you look at the painted ostrich eggshell fragments at the top left, you see that omega-shaped anchor, or anchor-shaped omega, whatever it might be. Bottom left, you see what must be an anchor. And we just found this recently on the top right. Looks like a wedding cake. We think it might represent a lighthouse, for which there is some evidence at Berenike, and of course, Poseidon or Neptune's trident. So, all very tantalizing. We also found some vesicular basalt on the surface of the site. We didn't have to dig this. It was right there, as you see it with the Bedouin posing there. We did chemical analysis on this. David Peacock did and James Harrell did. They both came to the same conclusion. It's sourced from Qana, a port, as you can see, on the Indian Ocean coast of Yemen today. Qana was an intermediate port between Berenike and ports in the Indian Ocean. So ships would have stopped there to resupply. But it was an important stopping point in its own right, because it was here that frankincense and myrrh would be loaded onto the ships and sent on to India or the Red Sea or wherever. And if you're not familiar with ship's ballast, I pulled an image from the internet and get an idea of what that's used for here, to sort of steady these ships when they get out to sea, especially in rough waters. We have anchors, or at least we assume they are. This stone one was not found in the harbor area. We think it was recycled. And we have remains of large chunks of iron rebuilt into later walls, such as you see circled there in white. And we believe that might have originally been part of an anchor. Then finally, what's really interesting, in 2010 and 11, in the southwestern harbor area, we started finding cedar ship remains. So these are parts of hulls of ships made of cedar wood. The long ropes there, of course, obviously were associated with some kind of ocean-going activities. All of the cedar wood we found had been charred, and we don't know if it had been charred in a fire accidentally or whether it was deliberately charred to be eventually turn it into charcoal. That we don't know. We don't know, furthermore, whether it was being taken off a ship to be replaced by better wood or whether just the opposite occurred. But it's a very interesting find and badly charred, so when we tried to move it, it tended to fall apart. So we did surgery in situ, so to speak, and here you can see the results. Those are little 5-centimeter scales. These were put together, these boards put together with obviously a pinned mortise and tenon construction technique, which is typical of Roman ships in the Mediterranean at this time. These date 1st, 2nd century. And so it's fairly clear that at least some of the ships plying the Red Sea in the early Roman period were built in a Mediterranean fashion. Probably other types of construction were used as well, but we don't have any evidence of that thus far. Here are some more of these charred cedar remains of ships, and if you look at the top one, you can see some of the tree nails there. Unfortunately, this isn't working, so I can't point it out, but if you look carefully on the lower part of the board there, you'll see some of the tree nails and another example of planking on the bottom. We also found the remains of a ship frame, unfortunately also charred. We tried to move this and it simply disintegrated, but you get an idea of how the ship's frame would have fit into the hull of one of these merchant ships. Now, very interestingly, we found a series of barnacles and sessile remains of mollusks that I'll show you in a minute, which bear on the ship repair and maintenance operations at Berenike. We found about 150 of these barnacles, and if you look very closely, you'll notice the pry marks. These have been pried off the wooden hulls of the ships, obviously for a variety of reasons, and if you look very closely at the micro photo below, you'll see the impression made by the barnacle from the wood of the ship. So it was clearly these grew on those portions of the ships that were not protected by the lead sheathing, which was really interesting. And then we have these sessile mollusks that have a very smooth, flat pattern here on the bottom. And the conclusion of our malacologist, yes, we have one who just specializes in seashells, who comes to the site occasionally. It's very smooth, and his interpretation is these mollusks then adhere to those parts of the ships that had sheathing on them. That's what accounts for the flatness of them. They don't have the impressions of the wood. So that's his current interpretation. And of course, the wood from the ships itself, the damaged parts, would need to be removed and replaced. And there's an age-old, it's a millennia-old tradition in Egypt of recycling ship parts into buildings, especially at port sites. And so I'll just show you a sampling of those. What I'm going to show you is a whole series of teak recyclings. We also have cedar wood. And interestingly, the teak appears in late Roman buildings and the cedar only in early Roman buildings. So we're not quite sure if that is a constant or whether that's an accident of our excavation. So you can see it here, and again, you can see the holes there where these things would have joined together. This is from a late Roman shrine from around 400 AD, the shrine of the Ptolemaic-Romans. Another shrine of approximately a similar date in the northern complex. We have this long beam. It's well over 3 meters long, indicated by the white arrow. Also teak, and if you look closely at these arrows, you can see again the holes in there that would have allowed these to be joined together with other elements to form part of the hull of a ship. And then there's another anchor down there. And again, used as leveling courses again at the top. So it's very common to see this recycled in buildings to level the courses part way up so that the courses of the building material stay even. We've even found them recycled as shelving. So again, this is a late Roman building. You can see the little alcoves there. And then the shelves, you can get a view of the detail of one of the shelves. These are also made of teak wood, and we're arguing from recycled ship parts. And finally, they were obviously very recycle conscious at Berenike. And they also, we found that the vast bulk of the building clamps that were used to hold the stones together were also made of teak wood, likely recycled again from ship parts. Okay, in case you don't know what a teak tree looks like, and I didn't really, these are from the internet, and they show you some teak trees in India. Okay, so we've looked at the evidence that suggests Indians were at the site. We've looked at ships that brought the material to the site. Now let's look at the irrefutable evidence, I should have said proof, that Indians were living at the site, and in some cases for very extended periods. So let's go back to the Isis temple, which has been over the years a little gold mine, literally a gold mine for us in terms of finds. And in 2018 and 2022, we had some trenches inside the courtyard area, which I showed you earlier. And it was at that time that we found fragments of that famous marble Buddha statue that you've seen, all over the place, full of misinformation about everything about it. And I'll try to make some corrections there tonight. So again, our orthophoto of the temple and a little diamond there locates where we found the initial Buddha fragments, because we found them in 2018 and 2022. And here again is a view looking north, indicating where these fragments were found. Okay, and here's a little drawing. So you can see the location in 2018 of these finds. We found the body, and we didn't know it was a Buddha figure. None of us were Indologists, which I'll show you. And then we found this little part of a radiate crown in 2018. And I'll show you that in a second. And then in 2022, we found the famous head that everybody's seen. And we quickly realized, well, maybe this goes with that body we found 4 years ago. And I'll show you how that all fit together. Within half an hour, I'll never forget that day, January 2022, within half an hour after finding the head, we found a Sanskrit inscription right by the head. I mean, it was an archaeologist's dream come true. And you can see in the bottom there where we found the two Satavahanas coins, clearly together, probably dedications, and then we'll talk about the repository in a second. So here's a photograph during the excavations, obviously looking towards the northwest part of the courtyard, and you can see the location of where we found the Buddha body, and again, we didn't know it was a Buddha, and part of the nimbus fragment in 2018. Okay, so and then you can see in 2022, a few meters off to the east, where we found the two main fragments of the head that are going to go together, and the Sanskrit inscription. So this is actually how we found the fragmented head on that January day in 2022. It had clearly fallen at some point from the statue, hit a rock, and shattered into two parts, actually more than two parts. And then, so then we said, okay, hey, that fragment we found in 2018, that part of the halo at the top left there, does that go with the head? And so we trotted it out and go, ooh, yeah, it does. Isn't that great? So we were very happy about that. So that's the front and back of the marble Buddha head. And then we said, does it go with that body we also found in 2018? Let's hope so. And in fact, photographically, we put the two together, and they fit. We did not put these together physically. The body had gone to the storage magazines at Guft in 2018, so all we could do was fit them photographically. But the Egyptians have since put the two together, and they're now on display in a new museum in Suez. So I've yet to visit that museum, but it's on my list. So what's so interesting about this marble piece is that it was not imported from India. The marble is Mediterranean marble. Okay, your head starts to go, oh, wow, well, what does that mean? Well, it means it was made here, wasn't it? And who's going to know anything about Buddha figures in the West? Got to be somebody from India who knows about these things. So let's take a look at this. There are, of course, similarities between our marble Buddha and, coin representations of Buddha on Kushan coins from the 2nd century, and other Buddha figures from Gandhara especially, but the gold coin, unfortunately, is not from our site. And chemical analysis on the marble shows it comes from the Proconesian quarries in the Sea of Marmara, just southwest of Istanbul. So you say, well, how did it end up in Berenike? Proconesian marble was used all over the place for all kinds of things. So our speculation is it was shipped to Alexandria, which was a sculpture school, And then somebody at Berenike, either a very wealthy Indian or a group of Indians, decided we want to make a major contribution to the Isis temple. And so this would have taken a fair amount of money and would have taken a fair amount of time. And who, if you're just going to be at the port a couple of weeks, is going to do this? It's got to be someone who's probably a long-term resident. And of course, there's plenty of parallels with Gandhara images from, with our Berenike image and images from Gandhara and elsewhere in the subcontinent. But there's features of ours that just aren't from India. They're clearly something from the Mediterranean. So our piece is a very eclectic piece. It represents Buddha for sure, but a lot of the details are not Indian. They're Western, which makes this piece really interesting. And take a look especially at the hairstyles. Now I'm just quoting our art historian here. Look at she calls them tortellini curls, okay? So and the last time I checked, that's more or less what tortellini looks like. Not quite. But anyway, you can see it's got the bun, the top knot of a Buddha. It's got the elongated ears, which were probably originally painted. Maybe the whole thing was originally painted. We don't know. But the closest parallel she could find were, in fact, with hairdos from the Roman world. And if you take a look at these Roman women, this particular hairstyle was popular in the latter part of the 1st century and into the 2nd century A.D. And it's this, as a result of other things I can't get into, not being an art historian, that she dates our Buddha figure to. So it's dated stylistically to the end of the 1st century and into the 2nd century A.D. It also has a lotus flower, which you typically find associated with Buddha figures or Bodhisattva figures. Again, the placement here is, there's no real good parallel from India. This seems to be an attribution, not the lotus flower itself, but its placement seems to be something introduced from the West. Now, how would this Gandhara style have reached Berenike for these people to carve? Well, you see the location of Gandhara here today in the Pakistan, Afghanistan area, which produced large quantities of these images. The nearest ports through which this influence could have flowed are these two in northwestern India at Bari Gaza and Barbari Cone. And very interestingly, in a document titled the Periplus Maris Erythraei, or the Periplus of the Erythraean Sea, is a document we all use if we're working in the Red Sea. It's anonymously authored, probably sometime in the middle of the 1st century. It lists all the ports you could put in it and the kinds of products that would be exported from and imported to those ports. And Barbari Cone and Bari Gaza are mentioned in there repeatedly, as is Berenike. So we know that there was contact among those 3 ports. So we found the Buddha. We've looked at the Buddha figure now, and I'm sure there might be questions later on. Within half an hour after we found that shattered head, we'd seen this squared stone, which had nothing on it, and we said, we got to turn it over. We got to turn this over. And we did, and we were very surprised, as you will see. So let's take a look at that. So the location is just right with the 2 heads, 2 fragments of the head, and a little bit east of the body that we found in 2018. Whoops. Here it is. So we found it. You can see the dimensions there. And again, none of us were Indologists, so we looked at this. Our Egyptologists looked at it. Our classicists looked at it. Everybody looked at it. Well, it's none of the following. And so by default, it's got to be some strange, weird, South Arabian or Indian, which was really exciting. We were getting bored with Greek inscriptions after a while. And so, come on, when you got 80 from the temple alone, after a while, okay. So we get very jaded. But anyway, working with photographs, and he finally came out this past January, the green is his overwrite of what actually exists on the stone. The red is a reconstruction of what he thinks should be there. And the black, if you look in the top right, is a very laconic Greek, not even a translation, but a paraphrase of what's in the Sanskrit. And it's a fascinating document. It's the only securely dated Sanskrit document anywhere. It's dated precisely to September 9th, 248 AD. It's also the only known Sanskrit inscription that mentions a Roman emperor by name, Philip. And in his 6th year, and some of you numismatists out there are going to say he never had a 6th year, and I'll tell you how we know that, okay? So here's a synopsis in yellow of what appears on the text, which will also be published at the end of next year. The Indian Dedekin is known. His name is Vasula. He was from the warrior class. This class appears extensively in graffiti from a cave on the island of Socotra, hundreds of them actually, in the Indian Ocean. There's a dedication of an image, not mentioned or lost. Is it a Buddha figure? And if so, is it our Buddha figure? If it's our Buddha figure, over 100 years separates the manufacture of our Buddha figure, the marble one, from the inscription. Did this guy rip it off and repurpose it? You know, the original dedicants were long gone. It's certainly a possibility, but we don't know. And then we have the very laconic Greek, which simply mentions this is a dedication. Now, other evidence or proof that Indians were actually on site comes from the portico area. You see the red arrow there, and you see in the red box there, repurposed as a bench. And when we looked at the bench originally, we took photos. It's very faint. We had to get just the right light, which isn't evident in this photograph here. Turned out it's a Tamil Brahmi graffito from the 2nd or the 3rd century. And it mentions a donation of a pedestal for a female deity. So we're still working on this, or I'm not, but the team is, and there'll be more information on that soon. Now, finally, penultimately, we also dug a small room that was an annex or a repository that was built onto the southern exterior side of the Isis temple. You see it here boxed out in yellow, that was added to the temple sometime in the 4th or 5th century. So it's a much later addition, an afterthought to the temple. This little room is tiny. It's less than 2 by 2 meters. It was absolutely packed with stone, metal, and wooden dedications. Those Serapis figures came from here. And we every 30 minutes, the trench supervisor would call me over and say, here's another statue, here's another this. And after a while, we get, okay, I'll check it out when you have 2 or 3 of them. Don't bother me now. So that's the site. I mean, that's just the nature of our site. It's rich. And so there is this repository. Again, in green, here are 2 images of it. You can see the architecture is very, very different from the original temple. We think it's a repository. Perhaps people in late antiquity decided they had to clean out portions of the dedications in the courtyard area to make room for more dedications, and that's how they ended up here. We don't really know why these objects, which date from the 1st century to the 5th, but all deposited at the same time in late antiquity, we don't know why for certain they were placed here. But this is our second Buddha. Most people think that only one Buddha comes from Berenike. We have 3. The marble one is the, that's the one everybody's heard about, but we have 2 others. So here's the one from this repository. It's clearly not up to par with the marble one, but if you see, it's clearly a Buddha figure. It's got the top knot. It's got the elongated ear, probably painted. Obviously, it's sort of a third-rate product, but what's so interesting is that it comes from a workshop at Berenike. How do we know this? It's made of local stone, just like the inscription I forgot to mention is also made of local stone. So these things were produced at the site. And if you take a look at those top 4 figures that we found in various parts of the site, dating probably to the 2nd or 3rd centuries AD, you're clear there was a workshop active here, making heads of typical Greco-Roman deities, Egyptian deities, and so on. And if you look at our Buddha figure, compare his mouth, his nose, and his eyes with those there, clearly from the same workshop. So someone, obviously, with lesser means than our marble dedicants offered that. And then finally, this really blew us away, if I can use that American hyperbole. Okay. We found this relief in the same little repository that we found the teak heads of Serapis and the marble the local stone. We found this, and again, none of us were Indologists. We looked at it, and okay, we know what it is, and we don't know what it is, and we showed this to a numismatist who's at the Ashmolean, and he said, oh, yes, well, you have 3 Hindu gods here, or avatars of Hindu gods. And there they are, their names, which I won't attempt to pronounce, okay, to embarrass myself. And he pointed to plenty of numismatic evidence predating our relief, which probably dates to the 2nd or 3rd century, can't be certain. He had plenty of numismatic parallels to show that, in fact, yes, these are the deities being represented in a very crude form on our relief. And here's some punch-marked coins showing one of the other deities. Okay, and finally, this is it, I promise. In the northern complex, which I referred to earlier, we found a 3rd Buddha figure. Again, not as impressive as the marble one, a little bit more impressive than just the head that I showed you. So here's the northern complex where we spent a lot of time digging lately. This is the room from 3 different views of the room in which we found not only the Buddha figure, but a number of other figurines in stone and bronze, many of them representing deities, some of them not. And here he is. He's not big, as you can see from this scale. It's only a 5 centimeter scale. He's made of a local gypsum, a fairly fine gypsum. He's missing his head and his feet. But if you look at the drapery, and if you look at what he's holding in his left hand, his part of the drapery, that's very, very typical, as you can see, of Buddha figures. Not only our marble one from the Isis temple, which you see second from the left there, but also numerous Buddha figures from Gandhara and from other places in India. So the canonical or the iconical representations are very clear. Here's some close-ups again of that gypsum figure on the left from the northern complex, the marble figure from the Isis temple on the right, and again, plenty of parallels for them holding the pottery, the clothing, indicating that these are clearly Buddha figures. So what do we make of all of this evidence? Well, in a nutshell, clearly they were building ships and repairing them, and they were shipping Indians in from India along with their goodies. And so I think we can now dispel with the idea that maybe they didn't really show up there. It was just their products and their goods. They were there. And I think I've presented enough evidence to show you that that's provable. Okay? So thank you very much. Yeah, I know. Well, I mean, like I said, I had a hard time deciding what to talk about tonight. 30 years, I mean,
Yeah.
so this is what I...
Well, I'm exhausted. That was amazing. Incredible, just incredible finds. I've got
why I keep
2
going back.
sides
That's why I
of
keep going
paper of
back.
questions to ask. But the first question I'm going to ask you before I put hands up, and I know the answer to this, but I don't think you mentioned it, and I really love you to tell people.
Okay.
Preservation. We, as archaeologists, know that you don't usually get textiles and wood and all these beautiful organics in archaeological sites. So why do you get them in Berenike?
Yeah, or Kusero Kadim, where you dug,
Yeah.
anywhere in the desert. And it doesn't have to be Egypt, it can be the deserts in North Africa or Syria or elsewhere. It's incredibly dry, arid climate, so stuff tends to be well preserved, just as much as it would be in a very bog type thing, which would create an anaerobic environment for that kind of thing as well. So the preservation is incredible. I mean, the early Roman trash dump, for example, we actually find the exoskeletons of dung beetles that died in the trash in the 1st century. And we found locust remains, we found larvae of a locust from the 1st century. So, I mean, the preservation is unbelievable. It's just, and that along with the great finds is what keeps me going back.
Now, what did you say? 40 years. Have we
Yeah,
got
maybe
other
for
questions?
40 years. We'll see if we make it. Yeah.
You will.
Thank you very much. Absolutely wonderful journey from India to Egypt. And I work on the Parthian period.
Okay.
And it's interesting that you mentioned that they were actual Indian merchants in Berenike. I mean, we have evidence, for example, from Palmyra and from Caracini, that merchants traveled to Caracini and to Vologasias.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a very unusual thing to do that.
Yeah.
So this is more proof, really.
Well, one of the interesting things I didn't have time to talk about, again, from our art historian, this will be in this article that I referenced, is that there are some very interesting parallels for that sort of ray, that nimbus ray. And you see it on some of the Palmyrene Triad, or one of the places it appears. It appears on Mithras as well. So again, there's a lot of eclecticism going on with the representation of that piece. Yeah, and people seem to think the global economy is a modern post-World War II thing. No. No, this was going on long before.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Thank you very much. That was fascinating. I heard Olaf Kaper in Leiden last year talk about it, but that was just on the temple, so you gave a much bigger overview. Have you excavated the ship repair area? Because it obviously would be very interesting to know about the Indian techniques.
Sure.
And the other thing I was just going to ask is about the other side. I know there have been excavations at Patnam, and whether it's Busiris or not.
Right.
And I just wonder what, I know Roman coins have been found there, but if there have been excavations further up at Babaricon and Baragosa.
Yeah, we would like to. It's always a matter of time and money, and what the permits allow. Increasingly, the permits are very restrictive as to not only when we can dig, but where we can dig on the site. So yes, believe me, there's plenty of places. I mean, we've excavated maybe 2% of the site. It's going to be generations long after we're gone if it's excavated properly. This will still be going on. I'm certainly hopeful, even though I'll be dust, that this will still be going on. So it's a massively important site, and again, we're only limited by, well, permits, time, and money, the usual constraints when you're working in that part of the world. I actually dug at Ptolemaic in 2008 with Cherian, and it wasn't that year that they found that canoe that he talks about, which they found the previous season. And the discussion as to whether Ptolemaic is Muziris, I know has gone on, especially in the Indian press a lot lately, whether that's due to jealousy on his colleagues' parts, that he couldn't possibly have found such an important port or not. I'm not going to comment on that. I'm going to stay out of that political quagmire. But if it is, it's certainly a major port, and there's been more Roman period amphor and other sherds found there than at any other site in India, including Archaeological do. So where there's smoke, there's fire. So I think if Ptolemaic isn't Muziris, where's Muziris? But again, I'm not a specialist on Muziris, but I tend to buy Cherian's identification there. Mm-hmm.
I'm interested in a speculation. I mean, obviously, you've got Indians and of status as well. Do you think they come in their own ships?
Well, that's a good question because, again, we don't know exactly how the Indian ships would have been built. There's been speculation, that they were built using timber and ropes. I mean, there's all kinds of speculation on what they may have looked like. To my knowledge, none has ever been excavated anywhere. Maybe I'm wrong now, but I don't think so. Even in the Red Sea, which has lots of wrecks, as Lucy knows, there have been no excavations of Roman wrecks. They've been identified, but not excavated. So I can't answer that, but certainly it wasn't just a one-sided deal. It wasn't just the Romans going to India. It must have been, as we saw, Indians coming to the Western world. And who's to say they couldn't have come on board an Indian-built ship? Or maybe a lot of these ships turned out to be eclectic. I mean, so your ship sails from Berenike to India. It's battered by the winds. It needs replacement parts, and what are they going to put in there? What's locally available and what they know how to build. And by the same token, Indian ships coming to Berenike requiring repair would probably have been patched up by people using a Western sailing tradition. So I wouldn't be surprised if you sort of have these Frankenstein-type ships floating around out there that end up, after a very long life, being a composite of building traditions from southern Arabia, from India, from Rome. It'd be very interesting to find a wreck like that. We'd all be very thrilled about that. But
well, there's certainly a good 9th century parallel to that. Yeah.
Pardon me?
There's a good 9th century parallel to that.
But that's, of course, long after
Indeed.
what we're digging.
You mentioned a lot of small finds like pottery and textiles.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Can you just explain whether they come from funerary or settlement contexts, please?
All of ours come from settlement contexts, except some of the beads that I showed you from the animal cemetery. Now, the separate project that's been going on now for 3 seasons by itself, that's led by the Polish team, they're digging actually in the northern necropolis. And so everything they're finding is clearly from a funerary context, which includes beads and jewelry and other kinds of things that were buried with the dead that hadn't been robbed subsequently. But all of the beads that we find, and the other stuff, the textile, comes from either religious contexts or from commercial or residential contexts, or from a trash dump that, came from wherever, yeah. Mm-hmm. Anything else? Okay. Well, as you see up there, if you have questions, you can email me. One of the few perks I got from 43 years working at Delaware is I got to keep my email address. So that will be permanent until I disappear from this earth, so you can always reach me there. Oops. Yeah, watch that thing sticking out there. Yeah. Yeah.
Good. I'd just like to thank you enormously. This has been a dazzling revelation. You've told us so much. Oops. Can you hear? Yes. You've told us so much that none of us knew about, and we have hundreds and hundreds of questions. So thank you for giving us your email.
You're very welcome. And of course, I've just shown you a small part of the site. I haven't been able to talk about a lot of different things, so there's plenty out there. And we're waiting for Chinese. You know, we're getting greedy now. We have Buddhas. Okay, we don't need any more of those. We've got Hindus. That's great. We now want Chinese. So we're getting very greedy. We'll see what turns out.
Well, it's been a dazzling talk, and thank you very
You're
much
welcome.
indeed
You're very
on
welcome.
behalf of all of us.
You're very welcome.
Now it's time for a drink.
Okay.
And now it's time for a drink.